Welcome back, everyone. This morning started like any other. Pancakes on the table. Coffee still steaming. My wife smiling across from me. And then our 4-year-old son looked up at her and said, "Mommy, when is that funny uncle coming back?" I laughed at first. I shouldn't have. Because in that moment, my wife didn't. She froze. And that's when I realized I had no idea who my son was talking about. It was the kind of morning that feels so ordinary you don't even think to remember it. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen blinds in soft golden stripes, landing across the table where my wife had set out plates of pancakes shaped like little animals. Our 4-year-old was giggling at the syrup pooling around a blueberry eye, and I was halfway through my first cup of coffee. Scrolling lazily through my phone, the smell of butter and toast hung in the air. It was calm, safe, familiar. My wife looked relaxed. She had that quiet morning glow, hair loosely tied back, sleeves pushed up slightly as she reached for the orange juice. She caught me staring and smiled, the kind of smile that says, "We're doing okay." There was nothing unusual about the moment. Nothing dramatic, just a small family in a small kitchen, starting another predictable day. Our son was swinging his legs under the chair, humming to himself between bites. At 4 years old, his world is simple and honest. He says whatever crosses his mind, whenever it crosses his mind. No filters, no strategy, just pure, unedited truth wrapped in a tiny voice. He took another bite of pancake, chewed thoughtfully, then looked up at his mother. "Mommy?" She turned toward him, distracted but warm. "Yes, baby." He tilted his head slightly, syrup shining on his chin. "When is that funny uncle coming back?" At first, I didn't process the words. I let out a small laugh, assuming he was talking about one of my cousins or maybe a friend who had stopped by recently. Kids make up nicknames all the time. Funny uncle could mean anyone. He even smiled, expecting my wife to chuckle and explain. But she didn't laugh. She didn't even move. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth, not dramatically, just pause. Set, frozen in a way that felt unnatural, like someone had pressed a remote and hit pause on her. The smile she had a second ago didn't fade. It vanished. Completely. The room changed in an instant. It wasn't loud. There wasn't a crash or a raised voice. It was quieter than that. Heavy. The kind of silence that feels thick in your ears. I looked from my son to my wife, still not fully understanding. "Funny uncle," I repeated lightly, almost teasing. "Who's that, champ?" Our son grinned. "The silly one, the one who makes mommy laugh." I felt something small shift in my chest. Still not panic. Not yet. Just confusion. We don't have family nearby. No brothers visiting. No close friends who drop by during the week. And definitely no one I'd heard my son described like that. I glanced at my wife again. Her eyes flickered toward me for half a second, and that's when I saw it. Not anger, not sadness. Fear. A flash of something unguarded and raw, before she quickly looked back at her son. "What funny uncle, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice carefully steady, but just slightly higher than normal. "The one who comes when daddy's at work," he said casually, reaching for his juice. "He's funny. He tickles me and mommy laughs a lot." The words landed softly but hit hard. When daddy's at work. I felt my grip tighten around my coffee mug. I became suddenly aware of every small sound, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the scrape of my son's fork against his plate. My mind started racing ahead, trying to catch up with what I'd just heard. My wife let out a quick, tight laugh. "Oh, honey, what are you talking about?" she said, brushing imaginary crumbs off the table. "You must be dreaming." "I'm not dreaming," he insisted, frowning slightly. He came lots of times. Loads of times. The sunlight in the kitchen didn't feel warm anymore. It felt exposing. Harsh. Like it was illuminating something I hadn't noticed before. I searched my memory for any explanation that made sense. A neighbor? A repairman? A relative who visited once and left an impression. But nothing fit. Nothing even came close. I realized I was staring at my wife, waiting for her to fill the silence. to laugh it off properly, to give me a name I recognized. Instead, she reached for a coffee with a hand that trembled just enough for me to notice. And in that moment, something subtle but irreversible shifted inside me. Because I knew my wife. I knew her rhythms, her tells. I knew when she was genuinely confused, when she was amused, when she was irritated. This wasn't any of those. This was someone trying very hard to appear normal. Our son had already gone back to his pancakes, humming again, unaware that he had just dropped a sentence into the middle of our marriage like a stone into still water. Ripples were spreading. I forced a smile, but it felt tight. "Buddy," I said gently. "What's his name?" My wife's eyes snapped toward me again. Sharp this time, and that was when I realized this wasn't just an innocent misunderstanding. This was the first crack in something I had always believed was solid. The question should have faded away like most things a 4-year-old says. It should have been one of those odd little comments you laugh about later. But it didn't fade. It lingered. It sat at the table with us long after the pancakes were gone and the plates were in the sink. After breakfast, I knelt down to help my son wipe the syrup from his hands. I kept my tone light, casual, like we were talking about cartoon characters. "Hey, buddy," I said gently. "That funny uncle, what's his name?" He shrugged at first, distracted by the bubbles in the soap. "I don't know." "You don't know?" I smiled. "Does he look like Uncle Mark?" He giggled. "New." "He's not old." "Not old." I felt a quiet pulse in my chest. "Okay. What does he look like?" My wife moved quickly behind me, stacking dishes louder than necessary. The clinking of plates felt sharp against the quiet kitchen. "He has a beard," my son said confidently. "And he makes funny faces, and Mommy laughs." I could feel her watching us. I didn't need to turn around to know. "When does he come over?" I asked, still keeping my voice steady. "When you go to work," he answered without hesitation. "Sometimes after my nap, sometimes before." The casual certainty in his tone made it worse. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't imagining. He was recalling. I finally stood up and turned toward my wife. "Do you know what he's talking about?" Her expression was controlled, too controlled. "He watches too many shows," she said quickly. "He probably made it up. He said the man comes here." "He's 4, she replied, a little sharper now. "He also said there's a monster in his closet last week." That would have been convincing if it weren't for the tiny tremor in her voice. I tried to shake it off. Kids blur reality and imagination all the time. Maybe he dreamed something. Maybe a neighbor waved once and it became a story. I wanted a simple explanation, but he made a need. Later that afternoon, while she was folding laundry in the bedroom, I sat beside my son in the living room with his toy cars spread across the rug. "Does the funny uncle drive a car?" I asked, pretending to zoom a toy truck across the floor. "Yes," he said instantly. "A dark one." "What color? Black or blue?" "I don't know." "Dark." That wasn't helpful. Half the cars in the neighborhood were dark. "Does he bring you toys?" "No. He just plays and talks to Mommy in the kitchen." Talks to Mommy in the kitchen. There was a picture forming in my head now. Not clear, not complete, but enough to make my stomach feel heavy. "What do they talk about?" I asked. He shrugged. "Grown-up stuff." I swallowed. That evening, when my wife and I were alone in the kitchen, I brought it up again, calmly. Measured. "You know," I said, leaning against the counter. "It's weird he keeps mentioning this guy." She didn't look at me. "He has an imagination." He described a beard, a car, specific times. She sighed loudly, like I was being unreasonable. "So now you're interrogating a preschooler." I'm trying to understand. There's nothing to understand. Her defensiveness came too fast. Too strong. It didn't match the situation. If it were truly nothing, she would have laughed it off. Teased me for over. Instead, Her shoulders were tight, jaw clenched, movements stiff. I started replaying the past few months in my head. There were days she seemed distracted when I came home. Days she showered immediately after I walked in. Times she mentioned running errands that took longer than expected. At the time, I didn't question it. Marriage runs on trust. You don't cross-examine every delay or mood shift. But now those small memories rearrange themselves differently. That night, after our son was asleep, I asked again. More direct. Has anyone been coming here while I'm at work? She stared at me like I'd insulted her. Are you serious? I'm asking. No, of course not. Then why does he think someone does? She crossed her arms. Because he's a child. Silence stretched between us. It wasn't explosive. It was colder than that. Controlled. Careful. I realized something unsettling then. This wasn't just about whether someone had come over. It was about the fact that I didn't know. There was a gap in my understanding of my own home, my own routine, my own wife's day-to-day life. The next morning, I paid closer attention. I noticed how quickly she changed the subject when our son started talking freely. How she hovered nearby whenever I asked him questions. How she laughed too quickly at unrelated jokes. And our son, unaware of the storm quietly building, continued offering fragments. He's really funny, he told me later while coloring. Mommy smiles a lot when he's here. Not like when she's tired. Not like when she's tired. That detail hurt more than anything else. Confusion had slowly transformed into something heavier. Suspicion doesn't arrive loudly. It seeps in. It fills empty spaces you didn't know were there. Every neutral detail starts to look like evidence. Every silence feels intentional. I didn't want to believe anything was wrong. I wanted to trust her. But trust, once nudged even slightly off balance, doesn't sit still. It wobbles. And the more I tried to dismiss it, the more the pieces refused to settle back into place. Once doubt takes root, it doesn't stay small. It spreads quietly, attaching itself to memories, to routines, to details you once ignored. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself I trusted my wife. But trust had started to feel less like certainty, and more like something I was forcing myself to hold on to. Over the next few days, I began noticing things I would have once dismissed completely. Her phone used to sit casually on the kitchen counter. Now it was always face down. If a notification buzzed, she picked it up almost immediately. Once, when I walked into the room unexpectedly, she tilted the screen away before locking it. It was subtle, quick, but I saw it. I didn't confront her right away. Instead, I observed. On Wednesday, she mentioned she was running to the grocery store after dropping our son at preschool. I checked the receipt later that evening while taking out the trash. The timestamp was nearly 3 hours after preschool drop-off. The store is 15 minutes away. Maybe there was traffic. Maybe she stopped somewhere else. There was always a reasonable explanation. That was the problem. Every detail could be explained, but together, they felt different. That night, while she showered, her phone lit up on the nightstand. I wasn't proud of what I did next, but Amira picked it up. The screen was locked. I didn't know her password. That, in itself, wasn't new. We'd never shared passwords formally, but suddenly it felt intentional. A notification preview flashed briefly before disappearing. Miss you already? No name, just a number I didn't recognize. My chest tightened. I told myself it could be a friend, a relative, anyone. But the timing, the secrecy, our son's words, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. When she came out of the shower, I handed her the phone casually. You got a message? She froze for half a second before taking it. Oh, she said lightly, probably spam. She didn't check it in front of me. She walked into the hallway instead. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything. The bearded man, the dark car, the kitchen conversations. Mummy laughs a lot. The grocery store trip, the hidden screen. By Friday, I decided I needed clarity more than comfort. I left work early without telling her. The entire drive home, my heart pounded harder than it should have. I hated myself for feeling like a spy in my own life. The not knowing felt worse as I turned onto our street. Primero slow it down. There, Parked 2 houses down was a dark sedan I didn't recognize. Maybe it belonged to a neighbor's guest. Maybe it had nothing to do with us. But my pulse spiked anyway. I pulled into the driveway quietly and stepped out. The house looked normal. Curtains half drawn. No loud noises, no obvious signs of anything unusual. I unlocked the front door slowly. Voices. Low. Muffled. From the kitchen. A man's voice. I couldn't make out the words. Just the tone relaxed. Familiar. Then I heard it. My wife laughing. Not the polite laugh she gives co-workers. Not the tired half-laugh at the end of a long day. It was full. Bright. Effortless. For a second, I couldn't move. My mind raced through last-minute excuses. Maybe it was a repairman. Maybe a relative I forgot about. Maybe then I stepped forward into the kitchen doorway. He was standing near the counter. Mid-30s, beardy casual clothes, taller than me. Comfortable. Too comfortable. My wife stood across from him, her hand lightly resting on the edge of the counter, eyes still warm from laughter. They both turned when they saw me. The air changed instantly. The man's expression shifted from relaxed to startled. My wife's face drained of color. For a moment, no one spoke. Then her son ran in from the living room, excited. "Dottie! That's him! That's the funny uncle." The words echoed louder than anything else in the room. The man gave a small, awkward wave. "Hey," he said carefully. I looked at my wife. "Who is this?" Her lips parted, but no words came out immediately. "This is Daniel," she finally said. Her voice sounded distant, like it wasn't fully connected to her body. "Daniel who?" I asked. She hesitated again. Stepped in. "We're just friends. Just friends." The most overused phrase in the world. "Friends who come over when I'm not home?" I asked. My voice steadier than I felt. "It's not what you think," she said quickly. I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. Our son tugged at Daniel's hand. "Show Daddy," the silly face. Daniel gently pulled his hand away. I looked at the kitchen, at the 2 coffee mugs on the counter. But, fool, at the comfortable distance between them that didn't look accidental. "How long?" I asked quietly, not taking my eyes off her. She shook her head. "It's not like that." "How long?" I repeated. Silence. And in that silence, I understood more than any confession could have told me. This wasn't a random visit. It wasn't the first time. It wasn't an innocent misunderstanding. It was something that had been happening quietly, repeatedly, while I believed everything was fine. The unraveling wasn't explosive. There was no screaming, no thrown objects, just the slow collapse of certainty. I had spent days piecing together fragments. Now the picture stood in front of me, and it was worse than not knowing. For a few seconds, after I asked how long, no one moved. The house felt smaller, like the walls had shifted inward. Daniel stood awkwardly near the counter, no longer relaxed, no longer smiling. My wife looked at me the way someone looks at a glass about to fall off a table, frozen between stopping it and accepting it. Already too late. Our son sensed something had changed. He stopped tugging at Daniel's sleeve and looked from one adult to another, confused. "Can you go play in your room for a little bit, buddy?" my wife said softly. He hesitated. "But please," I added, forcing calm into my voice. He shuffled away, glancing back once before disappearing down the hallway. The silence that followed was heavier without him there to soften it. I looked at Daniel. "You should leave." He opened his mouth like he was going to argue, then thought better of it. He grabbed his keys from the counter. "I didn't mean for this to leave," I repeated. He nodded and walked past me toward the door. I stepped aside just enough to let him through. As it closed behind him, the sound felt final, but not in the way I wanted. Now, it was just us. My wife leaned back against the counter as if her legs couldn't fully hold her weight. I had imagined this moment in my head during those sleepless nights. Imagined yelling, demanding, breaking something just to match the pressure inside my chest. But when it came, I felt strangely controlled. Too controlled. How long? I asked again. She swallowed. A few months. The words landed flat and sharp at the same time. Months, I repeated. It wasn't supposed to turn into this, she said quickly. It started as nothing. It always starts as nothing. How did you even meet him? At the coffee shop, near preschool. We kept running into each other. He has a niece there. I let out a slow breath. And you thought bringing him into our house was appropriate? She closed her eyes briefly. It wasn't like that at first. What was it like? Her voice cracked slightly. I was lonely. That answer surprised me more than anything else. Lonely, I echoed. We live in the same house. You're always working, she said, not angrily, but tiredly. When you're home, you're exhausted. We barely talk about anything real anymore. I stared at her. So you replaced me? No, she said quickly. I didn't mean to replace you, but you did. She shook her head, tears forming now. It wasn't physical at first. At first, the qualifier hung between us. I felt something inside me go very still. At first, she covered her face with her hands. That was answer enough. Primera turned away, pacing once across the kitchen. My mind was trying to process the timeline. Months of conversations, months of laughter in this same room. Months of my son seeing this man as someone familiar enough to call funny uncle. Did you ever think about what this would do to him? I asked quietly. Her hands dropped. I never meant for him to get attached. But he did. She nodded weakly. And you let that happen. Tears rolled down her cheeks now. But Tay didn't move me the way they once would have. Not because I didn't care, but because something fundamental had cracked. I was unhappy, she said. Not just with you, with myself. I felt invisible. Daniel listened. And I didn't. You used to. That cut deeper than I expected. I thought about the late nights at work, the promotions I chased, the stress I carried home without realizing how heavy it was. I thought about the conversations we stopped having because they felt repetitive. I thought about how routine can slowly turn partners into roommates if no one fights against it. But none of that justified this. You could have talked to me, I said. I tried. Every time I said I felt overwhelmed and you told me it would get better once things slowed down at work. I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped. I had said that more than onset. Still, there's a difference between emotional distance and betrayal. Did you love him? I asked. Her hesitation was shorter this time, but it existed. I don't know, she whispered. That might have hurt more than a yes. Do you love me? I asked. She looked at me fully then, eyes red, voice shaking. But it didn't sound certain. It sounded complicated. I leaned against the opposite counter, suddenly exhausted. The confrontation I had imagined dramatic, explosive, had turned into something slower and more devastating. Not just anger, but realization. Not just betrayal, but exposure. This wasn't just about Daniel. It was about the quiet spaces that had grown between us over years. Spaces we ignored until someone else stepped into them. You brought him into our home, I said finally, into our son's life. She nodded, unable to argue. That's not loneliness, I continued. That's a choice. Her shoulders shook as she cried silently. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth was loud enough on its own. For months, while I believed our biggest problems were schedules and stress, she had been building a separate world inside the same walls. And now that world had collapsed into mine, and there was no way to separate the damage cleanly. The worst part wasn't just what she did. It was realizing I hadn't seen it coming at all. The house didn't feel the same after that day. It looked the same furniture, same photos on the walls, same faint scratch on the dining table from when our son dragged his toy truck across it. But something invisible had shifted. Trust, once cracked, doesn't shatter loudly. It fractures quietly, leaving lines you can't ignore no matter how carefully you look. That evening, after hours of heavy conversation and long silences, we sat on opposite ends of the couch. Our son was asleep down the hall, unaware that the world he knew had tilted slightly off balance. The monitor on the coffee table glowed softly, his steady breathing filling the space between us. Neither of us knew what to say next. The anger I felt earlier had cooled into something more complex. Hurt, disappointment, a strange kind of grief, not just for what happened, but for what I thought we were. "I ended it," she said finally, her voice low and worn. "When you walked in today, that was the end." I stared at the dark television screen instead of her. It shouldn't have taken me walking in. "I know." Silence again. "I'll do anything," she added quickly. "Counseling. Transparency. Whatever you need." The word transparency lingered. It sounded clinical, necessary. But it also meant acknowledging that the easy trust we once had was gone. "Do you even understand what this did?" I asked quietly. She nodded, tears returning. "I hurt you." "Yes," I said, "but you also brought someone into our son's world. He thinks that man is normal. Safe. Funny." Her shoulders trembled. I didn't think it would go this far. That sentence echoed the entire situation. She didn't think. Or maybe she thought it would stay contained, controlled, hidden neatly in the hours when I wasn't home. But secrets don't stay contained forever, especially not around children who say the quiet parts out loud. Over the next few days, the house felt fragile. We moved around each other, carefully, like stepping across thin ice. She offered her phone without me asking, gave me passwords, answered questions I didn't even know I needed answered. Each answer helped, but also hurt. Yes, it had become physical. No, it wasn't planned. Yes, she felt guilty. No, she hadn't planned to leave me. Every truth was both relief and wound at the same time. I found myself watching her differently. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't stop. When she smiled at a message from a friend, I wondered. When she ran late from an errand, my chest tightened automatically before logic caught up. Suspicion, once introduced, doesn't leave eyes. One night, our son asked casually, "Is funny uncle coming tomorrow?" The question hit harder than any argument. My wife knelt in front of him, her voice steady but sad. "No, sweetheart, he's not coming anymore." "Why?" She hesitated. I stepped in gently. "Sometimes grown-ups stop visiting." He frowned, processing in the simple way children do. "Okay," he said eventually, then went back to his toys. He would move on quickly. Children adapt, but we would tea. A week later, we sat in a counselor's office for the first time. Neutral walls, soft lighting, a box of tissues placed strategically on the table. We spoke about loneliness, communication, resentment, routine. Words that once sounded abstract now felt painfully specific. The counselor said something that stuck with me. Affairs don't start in happy spaces. They grow in unattended ones. I thought about that long after we left. The unattended spaces in our marriage. The evenings spent scrolling instead of talking. The stress I brought home and never unpacked. The way we slowly stopped asking each other real questions. None of it excused what happened, but it explained how the ground weakened beneath us without either of us noticing. Rebuilding felt overwhelming. Trust isn't repaired with a single apology. It's rebuilt, inconsistent, small actions, transparency, patience, difficult conversations that last longer than either person wants them to. Some nights, I lay awake wondering if I would ever feel secure again. Other nights, I looked at her sleeping beside me and remembered the years before this. The vacations, the laughter, the birth of our son, the promises we made without hesitation. Love doesn't disappear instantly. It becomes complicated. There were moments when I considered walking away. The idea of starting over felt both terrifying and strangely clean. No lingering doubt, no painful reminders in the kitchen where it happened. But then I'd hear our son laughing in the next room, and I'd remember that marriage isn't just about two people. It's about the world you've built together. We started having conversations we should have had years ago. About exhaustion, about feeling unseen, about the quiet fears we both carried but never voiced. Sometimes those talks ended in tears, sometimes in silence, but they were real. She began showing up differently. More present, more open. I began listening differently, not just waiting for my turn to respond, but actually hearing. Still, the memory of that breakfast lingered. The sunlight, the pancakes, the innocent question that cracked everything open. Healing, I realized, isn't dramatic. It's repetitive. It's choosing every day to either step toward each other or away. It is accepting that the story of your marriage now includes a chapter you wish you didn't exist. Trust, once broken, never looks exactly the same when rebuilt. It carries scars, but scars mean something survived. Some mornings still feel normal again. Coffee steaming, light through the blinds, our son talking about school or cartoons, and sometimes, when she laughs in the kitchen, I notice the sound carefully, not to measure it anymore, but to understand it. That morning at breakfast changed everything. Not because of shouting, not because of drama, but because of one small, innocent question that forced the truth into the open. Sometimes heartbreak doesn't arrive with slammed doors. Sometimes it arrives with pancakes, sunlight, and a child who doesn't know he's revealing a secret. What I learned is this: marriages don't usually break in one moment. They weaken in silence, in distance, in the conversations we postpone, in the loneliness we don't admit out loud. And healing isn't automatic. It's a choice. Every single day, a choice to be honest. A choice to listen, a choice to fight for something, even when it's easier to walk away. That breakfast didn't just expose betrayal, it exposed the cracks we ignored. And sometimes, seeing the cracks is the only way to decide whether you rebuild or let it fall. If this story moved you, or made you think about your own relationships, make sure you subscribe, because sometimes the smallest questions reveal the biggest truths, and we're just getting started.